I need your help. I've discovered how a treasonous federal interagency workgroup is using deception to install communist policies in freedom-loving cities and towns that will eventually turn them into surveillance states that take away their individual rights.
The Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience, also called ELTRR or the Federal Plan, is supposedly infusing federal funding into communities hit hard by the pandemic to make them more resilient against future disasters. Under this pretext, radical policy changes will be expected in these local economies to foster what they call resilience, changes not just in health, but in education, housing, employment, transportation, food, water, justice, climate, etc. The recommendations instituted through the federal plan will affect what children will be taught in school, because it'll teach them to think like a communist, how communities are planned and budgeted, giving preferential treatment based on skin color, how much water can be used and what kind of food can be purchased, decided by equity and sustainability, and more. Measuring resilience will require collecting invasive amounts of data on children, adults, businesses, and other entities, which will be gathered and evaluated, tracked through indices like these, and then scored and judged based upon whether or not their behavior is contributing to the resilience or health of their communities. Social credit system ahoy! Essentially, the federal plan and its vital conditions framework are being used as a backdoor way of implementing the totalitarian targets of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. It will transform America's capitalist economy to what's deceptively termed a well-being economy, where growth isn't measured anymore by gross domestic product or GDP, but by very subjective indicators of well-being and health that will need government intervention and constant monitoring to ensure everyone has equal outcomes in resilience.
This is communism, folks, and it's at our door. If you don't want this coming to your community, please contact your state representatives. These people need to be held accountable and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for treason. Together, we can shine light on this agenda and work to stop it. Keep watching this video to learn more details about who's involved and how it's being implemented.
I want to start by also thanking Tyler Norris, Monty Roulier, and Bobby Milstein, because they were my partners in crime in those early days when I picked up the phone in March of 2020 and said, we need help, this is bigger than government. And they answered the call and led so many of you on this call and many who aren't with us through the exercise to develop the springboard. A lot gets said about what this moment calls for. It was certainly a moment when I picked up the phone and called Monty, Tyler, and Bobby. And I think that that is really poignant to think about. There are multiple moments that happen over time when there is a leadership call for stewards to join together and effect change. We started the ELTRR, that interagency work group, in a moment when we were reflecting on what we were seeing across the country. In many communities, the failed systems were falling apart before a virus arrived. It was not COVID that was causing the inequities that were flooding our communities. It was the recognition that there were decades of failure on the part of government, civil society, and many other leaders across sectors to invest in the kinds of things that we knew would have produced equitable well-being and resilience, the kinds of things that are called for in the vital conditions framework and in the LTRR. So this single notion that was elevated and brought forth in the springboard about as systems collapse, people rise, explains so much of how this plan came to be and what we need to continue to do. It also explains why a group of committed career officials born out of frustration and not wanting to be a part of returning to the way things were, the way those systems had been designed that resulted in so much pain and suffering, came together and slowly over time, not through official channels of asking for official formal appointments of political officials, but through our networks, through our relationships, we identified like-minded individuals who were thinking and understood if only we could do things differently. We could come together and craft an ambitious plan. Didn't know how long it would last or where it would take us, but we had to try. Those relationships will continue to be incredibly important. This is, without a doubt, part of a bigger movement. My colleague, Bobby Milstein, has done incredible work to very quietly be an observer of all of the different groups and entities that are contributing to this thriving together ethos. We think it's really important as students of social movements to recognize, one, that no one group can control or manufacture a social movement. But we can recognize that there are specific things that need to be built and present in order to really qualify as an enduring and long-standing social movement capable of the transformative change that we're looking for. So we have very informally mapped what are those functions you would expect to be present and who is taking part of them. I think it's important so you can find each other. It's also important so you can recognize none of us are doing this alone.
That woman speaking in the video is Becky Payne. She was with the CDC for 20 years and served on the interagency workgroup I just mentioned until she recently became the president and CEO of the Ripple Foundation, whose Rethink Health initiative in 2017 originally spawned the vital conditions framework the federal plan is based around. In the early days of the pandemic, the job that Becky and the other members of the task force within the National Response Coordination Center had was to come up with a plan for the recovery of the nation as well as for America's resilience to withstand future crises to come. As you heard her say, she called her friends Monty Roulier of the Community Initiatives Network, Bobby Milstein from the Ripple Foundation, and Tyler Norris of Wellbeing Trust to help her, along with other disgruntled senior career officials across many federal agencies, and Admiral Levine, to craft an ambitious plan to fundamentally change the way government invests its funds. With financial assistance from the CDC foundations, Monty, Tyler, and Bobby convened 100-plus contributors from progressive organizations already looking to destroy capitalism to churn out the Thriving Together Springboard. This paper was specifically created to conceptualize the main objectives for the forthcoming federal plan, which would borrow its vital conditions for health and well-being as a guiding framework for its 78 recommendations. At first glance, like most totalitarian measures that worm their way into policy, the federal plan actually sounds great. Who doesn't want to improve individual and community resilience and well-being nationwide as we recover from the economic and other downturns resulting from the pandemic? Of course, nobody. But the devil is in the details of how they plan to achieve this, quote, inclusive and government-wide approach that leverages the breadth of federal resources to, as they say, equitably achieve enhanced resilience. The key word there is equitably, and I'll give you a hint. It does not mean equal.
What if the government uniformly measured its success in terms of elevated resilience in communities across all dimensions that define healthy, thriving communities? The work group, in deliberating on these questions in 2020, determined that there were a couple of considerations that had to be paramount, one of which was this involved all of us, that it really is a public-private partnership to build resilience across this nation. That's what the federal plan intends largely to do, provide a lens through which agents across the federal government can entertain how they best apply their resources towards the same meaningful outcomes that ultimately define increased resilience. As the case it may be, or was, civil society was already thinking in these terms and had been even pre-pandemic, to the point where you see depicted on the left side of this slide, Thriving Together, which is an initiative across civil society that was intended to better orchestrate civil actors, non-governmental actors towards enhanced resilience in communities. The federal government's interagency work group working on this effort intended very deliberately to build out the federal plan over the ensuing months and years now in such a way that it could harmonize with that civil society effort. On the right, there's also a nod to the fact that it does very much harmonize with a number of subsequent executive orders and cross-governmental efforts that have occurred in the current administration. The framework for the vital conditions for health and well-being looks to define the actions that can be taken to enhance resilience through these different components that you see here. It may resonate in its familiarity with the social determinants of health framework, but that this offers a more inclusive and open relationship to those sectors that traditionally haven't been involved with SDOH necessarily. I mean, ultimately, what these objectives are set to do is enhance that equity. The equity, as you see on the bottom there, in terms of access to federal resources, and more importantly, and most importantly, equity in terms of outcomes for communities and individuals. This work is being taken up organically already by federal government and partners outside of federal government.
Let's talk about a few things that were said in this video. First of all, you heard Rear Admiral Reed, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Health, proclaim that the federal plan's objectives are set to enhance equity, meaning there's not only the expectation of equitable outcomes for all individuals and communities, but access to federal resources needs to be equitable as well. Not equal, equitable. This is the lens he's referring to the federal plan providing for all federal agencies to use when it comes to divvying out their resources. This lens is a critical theory lens. Critical race theory, an offshoot of Marxism, claims that disparities in outcomes for some racial groups are not the products of personal responsibility or choices, but a result of the way the systems and institutions of America have been intentionally set up to keep people of color from having the same opportunities for achievement as white people. Critical race theorists like Ibram X. Kendi advocate for tearing down capitalism in favor of a government system that fixes past injustices with present discrimination. This is exactly what the federal plan intends to turn our government system and how it operates into. On page 14 of the ELTRR document, it explains that in order to create an equitable future where all people and places thrive without exception, that the government will need to eliminate long-standing disparities that, according to them, still exist, and that federal resources will have to be coordinated to address systemic racism and other inequities. As such, resilience building assistance in the 7 areas of the vital health conditions will be prioritized for communities that they say are historically marginalized or disadvantaged. This is in direct violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it promotes unequal treatment, in this case predistribution of federal resources and preferential treatment, based upon the color of someone's skin.
Wellbeing Trust was honored to partner with the Centers for Disease Control Foundation in convening the Springboard process, and of course to work so closely with the Community Initiatives and Rethink team as they coordinated all the work and the hundreds of partners, many of you that are there. Thriving together is a narrative of hope for this country, particularly at this moment when the country is saying we want to preference Black lives, we want to preference brown lives, we want to preference people of color, indigenous communities. What does it look like to build equity in a way that disproportionately ensures that people who've traditionally been left out, that base builds for everyone? That we do that right, everyone benefits.
In the Thriving Together Springboard, the federal plan emulates that Tyler Norris from the Wellbeing Trust helped create with the CDC foundations. They call this targeted universalism. In the basic needs for health and safety section under healthcare, they say, quote, "We must use a racial equity framework for all decisions to understand who benefits and who is left behind." Then go on to say that this includes decisions on who receives life-saving treatment. Will that mean in the future getting put in line for an organ transplant or being prioritized for access to a life-saving vaccine based upon your race and perceived level of oppression? Based on what they're saying here, I believe so. It was mentioned in the video with Rear Admiral Reed that the Vital Conditions Framework in the federal plan defines the actions the federal government can take to enhance resilience, and that it should look familiar to people in the webinar to that of the Social Determinants of Health Framework. For those of you who don't know what the social determinants of health are, they're said to be non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. The World Health Organization's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, as well as the Center for Disease Control, has defined them as, quote, "the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of daily life." These forces and systems include economic policies and systems, development agendas, social norms, social policies, racism, climate change, and political systems. So instead of traditional health promotion and disease prevention solutions that focus on root causes of disease, like changing behaviors related to obesity, smoking, and substance abuse that have been proven to affect a person's lifespan, proponents of the social determinants of health argue that effort should focus on more upstream factors, like environment, housing, nutrition, education, income, and more. Listen to Healthy Communities Delaware Executive Director Kate DuPont Phillips talk about how they've added data collection on these upstream factors or vital conditions to their state health assessment in order to be in line with the federal plan.
Many of you are probably familiar with this concept, upstream versus downstream, when we think about health, or the idea of prevention and root cause versus treatment. So these are not meant to be mutually exclusive. Many times in the past, state health assessments have focused on disease states, specific health indicators. We should really take the opportunity to think more about the upstream factors that influence a lot of different health conditions. If we think about individuals and their individual health needs, you can see on the bottom right corner, we tend to think about hospitals and specialists, and that is a really resource-intensive time and money, resource-intensive way to approach health. So the state health assessment this go-round is taking the opportunity to think more upstream. And what does that mean? It means we're going to think about the conditions in communities and our environments that help to promote health and well-being. That said, the state health assessment will include data on both upstream factors as well as specific health indicators. So as we think about these upstream factors, what are they? They're things like environment, housing, nutrition, education, and income. Many of you may be familiar with the story that we often use in public health to kind of explain this upstream versus downstream scenario. So I'll share that story briefly. Imagine a large river with a high waterfall. At the bottom of this waterfall, hundreds of people are working frantically trying to save those who have fallen into the river and have fallen down the waterfall, many of them drowning. As the people along the shore are trying to rescue as many as possible, one individual looks up and sees a seemingly never-ending stream of people falling down the waterfall and begins to run upstream. One of the other rescuers hollers, "Where are you going? There are so many people that need help here." To which the man replied, "I'm going upstream to find out why so many people are falling into the river." So as you look further upstream, you notice bridges in various states of repair along the river. Some are strong, made of sturdy components. Others are weak and debilitated with missing boards or flimsy railings. In the stream parable, we know that certain groups of people are more likely to fall in the river than others. This is an equity issue. They don't fall in because of individual weakness or intrinsic flaws. Rather, they just don't have the privilege that many of us have to live in communities with strong bridges. So that's one of the reasons we're really focusing on equity also in this state health assessment, to try to create environments for all that address these upstream factors. So that's another reason that we're using this vital conditions for health and well-being framework, which are very similar to social determinants of health, as the framework for the state health assessment. It addresses these upstream factors, the environments that enable us to be healthy and well. And those are the things you'll see on the vital conditions framework graphic on the right: a thriving natural world, basic needs for health and safety, humane housing, meaningful work and wealth, lifelong learning, reliable transportation, and belonging and civic muscle. Belonging and civic muscle is at the center because it really influences progress in all of the other vital conditions. Another reason we chose the vital conditions framework for the state health assessment is because the federal government is moving in the direction of using the vital conditions framework. Just a few weeks ago, the federal plan for equitable long-term recovery and resilience was released. And this is exciting for a few different reasons. It's an interagency plan. We know that the federal government is often siloed, but more than 30 agencies have collaborated over the last few years on developing this plan. It is intended to guide long-term investment from the federal government. It uses the vital conditions as its organizing principle. So we really have an opportunity in Delaware to align with this framework that's being used nationally, that's being moved towards nationally. And the idea of the plan is that it's going to provide an actionable path for this whole of government collaborative approach, specifically to improve the vital conditions. Now, the government recognizes that this is going to take a transformational systemic change. Another element of this plan that's exciting is that it really focuses on community-centered collaboration, understanding better what communities themselves believe and know that they need to improve related to the vital conditions. This idea is also supposed to maximize, so let's look at the money we already have, the steady state investments and other federal investments. How can we use them in a more combined and collaborative manner? And the entire plan, which is exciting, is focused around equity and specifically aims to eliminate disparities.
Why does it matter so much that these vital conditions will be baked into the State Health Needs Assessment, or SHA? Because for most states, the State Health Improvement Plan, or SHIP, is developed based upon the results of their state health assessment. If non-medical factors like providing high-density housing, addressing climate change, teaching comprehensive sexuality education and social-emotional learning in schools, and enforcing high minimum wages are included in the definition of what it takes to provide an environment that fosters the vital conditions for health and well-being, it's very easy to see how the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, the federal plan's recommendations for local government, can be implemented in local communities under the guise of promoting and improving state health. Or like the woman in the last video said, building better bridges for those who aren't privileged. Universal health care that uses targeted universalism to decide who gets life-saving treatments, here we come. Again, this is all about transforming America's economy, which values a merit-based free enterprise system where individuals are responsible for their own health and well-being, to one in which the government and their private sector partners institute socialist policies and rules to enforce what they say are healthy behaviors and healthy environments in the name of health equity. In other words, communism. And a one world health government is exactly what the World Health Organization and the United Nations are trying to achieve through the lever of health promotion and the creation of misleadingly termed well-being societies. Just like how the term resilience has been co-opted by the federal plan to mean something completely different, you should know that especially the words well-being, flourishing, thriving, and health are all being used as a facade to install totalitarian control of society.
Recent decades have witnessed great progress in human and technological development across the globe. We live in an interconnected world with easier access to commodities and services. Life expectancy and living standards are better than ever before. However, this progress has come at a cost and brought new challenges. In a highly competitive world, we are encouraged to produce more and consume more. The natural resources are becoming scarce, and climate change has led to extreme weather conditions. There is a need for a major shift in the current socio-ecological and economic models. Promoting health and well-being is at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals and the World Health Organization's 13th General Programme of Work. The WHO has called on decision makers to take bold political actions that would shift the world into a sustainable and resilient path. This cannot be achieved by the health sectors alone. The benefits are multi-sectorial, and investments need to be made by all sectors. Greater political commitments are needed by the highest levels of governance and by all partners across borders to implement the required sustainable change to promote health and well-being. Here are some ways to get started. Identify an entry point to integrate health and well-being into current policies. For example, solidarity, social cohesion, gender equality, equity, or leaving no one behind. This will integrate approaches and together form a platform for change. Then identify a champion to support the policy orientation. This can be at the highest level of the governance or at the local level, such as a city mayor. The process for developing policies and ideas to support it needs to engage all sectors, stakeholders, and people at every level. To implement the policies effectively, a supportive governance structure should be in place to enable strengthened legislation and reduced health risks and promote health and well-being. Share knowledge and build networks to address relevant public health issues. Transformative and collective efforts will be needed to ensure that we can reach the goals set in the SDGs agenda.
Act now for our health and well-being.
The federal plan is being used to sneakily launch this global agenda in the United States. They were even told in that video from the WHO how to do it. They identified the entry point of how to integrate health and well-being into all policies, which is equity and resilience. They identified a champion to support the policy implementation, which is Assistant Secretary of Health Admiral Rachel Levine, then put the supporting governance structure of the whole-of-government approach to achieve the vital conditions in place to enable strengthened legislation to enforce these collectivist policies. The federal plan even employed the help of the CDC's molecular epidemiology and bioinformatics team in the HIV lab branch to create visuals of how the vital conditions and the funding to support them relate to each of the federal departments.
Probably one of the things that I find most fascinating about the work that's been achieved is the mapping of many, probably well over 1,000 at this point, various resources within the federal government to include the buckets that we've defined here of resources that the federal government employs. a mapping of all of that to these vital conditions, which creates that opportunity for communities in need to define their requirements in a similar fashion, leveraging this lexicon of the vital conditions framework, and readily trace from those requirements to the resources that exist within the federal government.
The organizations behind the Thriving Together springboard that was the template for the federal plan didn't even hide the fact that they're trying to upend our economy and install something new like this. On page 80, they ask, how can we become midwives to an emerging well-being economy? One of the trend benders they identify in order to accelerate this shift is to redefine progress and shared prosperity by embracing benchmarks to measure progress that they say are more meaningful than stock prices or gross domestic product. What do they mean by this? Well, currently, GDP, or gross domestic product, a monetary measure of the market value of all the final goods and services produced in a specific time period by a state or country as a whole, is used to determine how fast economies are growing and how they compare to other economies. This is also being used to reflect the economic well-being of households by arguing that when households have more wealth, they tend to have a better standard of living because greater wealth can mean greater access to things that can improve daily life. Households that have increased purchasing power then drive the free market, creating demand for those goods and services which they believe will make them better off. America has a type of free market economy like this, where businesses are privately owned and the law of supply and demand, rather than a central planner like a government entity, regulates the production of goods and services and the cost of labor for their workers. This is in stark contrast to a command economy like communism, in which a central government authority dictates the levels of production that are permissible and the prices that may be charged for goods and services, as well as their, according to them, fair distribution. So how does the federal plan's vision of a well-being economy differ from either of these? Well, first off, a well-being economy, like they're saying in the springboard America should become like, would ensure that fair distribution wouldn't be fair or even. They'd like us to join countries like New Zealand, who have a well-being budget and who are part of the Well-Being Economy Alliance and belong to something that the alliance created called Well-Being Economy Governments, of which there are now 6. You can see here that one of the commitments that members of the Well-Being Economy Governments make is progress toward the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This slide contains an excerpt of a document about New Zealand's well-being budget. Instead of putting their budget toward efforts that are focused on growing their financial economic stability or resilience, New Zealand is prioritizing well-being at the center of all their financial decisions. New Zealand came up with their Living Standards Framework, which preferences investments in the Maori and Pacific communities, which they say have been historically marginalized and don't have as much well-being as the rest of New Zealanders. Sound familiar to the narrative in the U.S.? Additionally, they're focusing on a transformation of their economy to deal with excess greenhouse gas emissions, among other initiatives like focusing on mental health, health equity, housing, and various other changes that sound a whole lot like the recommendations also found in the federal plan. For the first time ever, the ministers and departments in New Zealand now have to submit budget bids that lay out how they plan to use the funding they receive to achieve the well-being priorities the government set forth in their budget. Priorities which ultimately are just reframings of the UN's, World Health Organization's, and World Economic Forum agendas. In this video on health promotion for well-being, equity, and sustainable development from the World Health Organization, you can see how the pandemic is being used as a catalyst for these types of huge economic shifts.
It's taken a pandemic to help us realize just how sick our world has become. We've been slaves to materialism, building our personal empires and countries' economies. We convinced ourselves that life was great. We ignored the cost to ourselves, other people, and our planet. When COVID-19 arrived, it forced us to stop. We had time to question our way of life. If we had done things differently, could we have been better prepared? We've realized we can't go on as before. How can we say our economies are thriving when the cost to our societies is so high? There is a way out of this, and we all have a part to play. Countries should be measuring their success by the well-being of their people and the environment they live in, not just by deals and trade or profits made on products that are threatening our world and our own survival. We need to stop pursuing the same old self-destructive priorities and create conditions for people to live better lives. Health should be factored into everything, both globally and locally. Some countries are already getting this right. Bhutan has a gross national happiness index, where indicators such as living standards, community vitality, and psychological well-being drive a more meaningful and sustainable way of life. New Zealand has a well-being budget, which uses human health, safety, and flourishing to assess the success of its policies. The UAE's happiness agenda ensures the government prioritizes happiness across all its policies, while Finland and other Nordic countries have adopted a health in all policies approach. But more of us need to come together and hold each other accountable to promote better living and turning it into real action to transform our lives. COVID-19 has cost the world dearly, but it's also given us a chance to change the path that we're on and create the future we want.
For the US especially, where businesses have huge sway in our society and politically, a well-being economy is going to look slightly different than straight-up communism. The alliances and networks pushing these well-being economies include a lot of big business players that want something that looks more like communo-fascism, where the public and private sector team up to achieve communist ends. Communo-fascism has been tried many times before and has failed miserably, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake, which is why we must stop this idea of a well-being economy in the US from spreading and succeeding. ESG, or environmental, social, and governance scores, are a good example of how communo-fascism works. It used to be that corporations were measured on whether or not they were meeting their shareholder obligations of continuous fiduciary responsibility and profit growth. Now, financial institutions and investors teamed up with government regulators to require that instead of that, businesses must gather data for and report on certain metrics that relate to their environmental, social, and governance practices that stakeholders want. This can mean reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions, how much they support social causes that advance a progressive equity agenda like Black Lives Matter or the LGBTQIA+ movement, or putting members on their board or hiring not based off of merit, but by representation of oppressed groups. If they have a low ESG score, businesses could get passed over by banks and investors for capital, which could mean little or no opportunity for growth or being edged out of the competition entirely. In actuality, ESG is just a way to get businesses to adopt standards that accomplish the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. A well-being economy will be implemented in a similar fashion. Just like in New Zealand, Finland, Bhutan, UAE, and other places, some common metrics to measure well-being in the nation must be established so that it can replace the measurement of GDP for progress and growth. And that's exactly what the interagency workgroup behind the federal plan did. On page 36 of their document, they mention they're using the objectives and measures from Healthy People 2030, our nation's decade-long blueprint for health, that align to the vital conditions for health and well-being framework, to serve as the foundation to develop a formal monitoring plan for the ELTRR. This means they'll have to collect data, and lots of it, to see if their communist agenda is making the impact that they want it to. They say that additional metrics that include objective and empirical measures of a community, as well as an individual's physical, psychological, social, behavioral, and spiritual propensity to thrive, will be evaluated and integrated, including measures from the existing Well-Being in the Nation, or WIN, measurement framework. Talk about a surveillance state. Do you want these invasive metrics to be collected on you? How about your children? You must understand that the collection of this data at the individual and community level and the thrust to put health, well-being, resilience, etc., or their definition of it into all policies was the lever identified by a cabal of groups long before the pandemic as their way to fundamentally change America and its economy. The pandemic and the huge amounts of flexible funding approved by our government to help recover from the impacts of it, like the American Rescue Plan, just gave them exactly what they need to put that plan into action. The WIN measurements you just heard in the federal plan were actually created by this cabal called the WIN, or Well-Being in the Nation Network. WIN was actually a joining of several strands of groups already looking to make radical reforms to the American healthcare system. The Well-Being Initiative for the Nation, led by the Samueli Institute, The Wellbeing Legacy Initiative out of the Providence St. Joseph Venture Wellbeing Trust that Tyler Norris headed up, and the 100 Million Healthier Lives Initiative that came out of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Joining of these groups and others in the WIN network was expressively formed for the purpose of advancing the well-being in the nation, or WIN measures. 100 Million Healthier Lives was tasked with creating the WIN measures by the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics to help them identify multi-sector measures to improve population and community health and well-being that also address social determinants of health. These measures and the data collected through them are meant to guide federal and state policy and resource allocation. They'll also be used by public health entities in local communities, like what we saw earlier is happening in Delaware, for their state health needs assessment, to provide evidence to support where public health must focus their efforts and budgets in their state health improvement plans in order for health equity to be achieved.
The National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics is a federal advisory committee that reports to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. They were asked by the Secretary over almost 4 years ago to recommend measures for population and community health that would work across sectors. They brought together over 100 plus groups across nearly every federal agency and across every sector, and together created a report in January of 2017 that said that in order to measure population and community health, we need to understand what health looks like in a number of different domains that relate to health and the social determinants of health. After that, they transferred the process of developing measures to 100 Million Healthier Lives, an unprecedented collaboration of change agents that was convened by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement that was already working across sectors in the country and across federal agencies to improve health, well-being, and equity. So how was the framework developed? The National Committee urged us to arrive at measure sets that created a measurement ecosystem. They said that we need a parsimonious set of core measures at the national level, but we also need an expandable menu of measures for use at the local and community level. They asked us to achieve a balance between standard, widely used measures like life expectancy, alongside those that might be promising or currently used in fewer places at this time, or where there may not be yet enough data availability for everyone to be able to use them, but have the potential to really help us learn and move the needle in terms of what creates health, well-being, and equity. An example is a perception of everyday racism, which seems to remove about 5 years from your lifespan if you feel that you're at high levels of everyday discrimination. It seems incredibly promising and interesting. We don't quite have enough data validation for that yet, and we don't have the data availability, but we'd love to see people try that out and see whether it ought to become a measure that we promote to the leading indicator set in a future iteration.
So in case you missed what's going on here, while the WIN Measurements website will serve as a living library of sorts to help communities find various frameworks they can put into place to collect data on common health indicators that there is a lot of evidence for, they're also hoping that communities pick up these other flexible data sets they've included in their document and on their website that they don't have a lot of evidence on yet, like how someone's perception of everyday racism affects their lifespan. If enough data is collected on this in enough communities, they can then use this as their evidence base to promote the measurement of the perception of everyday racism to the level of a leading indicator. This is concerning because leading indicators are the high priority objectives that communities are told to focus their investments on by the Department of Health and Human Services in order for their people to experience health and well-being. You can see in this table showing the added factors in red that since about 2015, the leading health indicators have been exponentially expanded to include social determinants of health like education, food and agriculture, transportation, environment, and even specifically recording disparate impacts by certain demographics. In the last column there are the well-being in the nation, or WIN measures, that focus on the well-being of people, the well-being of places, and of course, equity. You can only imagine if the measure of someone's perception of everyday racism, which is very subjective and not very scientific, is elevated to the level of a leading indicator, it can then be used as justification for funding practices and programs that unequally favor people of color and discriminate against people who aren't, all in the name of community health. When the 100 Million Healthier Lives program ended, it became Well-Being and Equity, or WE, in the world. They're also still in charge of the WIN measurements, their ongoing evolution as they accumulate more evidence for specific measures, and getting more and more communities to use them, with the eventual goal of having a racial justice and intergenerational lens applied to all national health measures for well-being and thriving. This is very, very bad.
We had a measurement and learning meeting that begins to apply a racial justice and intergenerational lens to our national measures for well-being and thriving. That truly included a diverse group of people from the grassroots to the grass tops. If you think about the WIN strategic priorities, they really reflect action across this. So advancing racial justice, advancing a shared movement for thriving together, leveraging the springboard that many of you helped to create as a framework, advancing the WIN measures for equitable recovery and resilience, advancing an equitable economy, advancing mental health and well-being, and addressing COVID inequities and resilience in the context of COVID. Leaning into that as a stress test that can help us create a better system, a new system. And as we Michelle, it means disrupting, it means dismantling and redoing. If you think about it, that our priority around addressing racial justice is all about shifting, acknowledging those legacies and shifting to trauma, to exclusion. Of course, our advancing that thriving movement together is about coming together in shared stewardship and relationship to chart that path to renewal that will focus on and shift toward those vital conditions. Our work on advancing WIN measurement, that third strategy, is about that third piece, changing what we measure and how we measure it, and with who gets to define what we measure and how we understand what matters. And as we think about that, we need to shift, of course, the context of our economy from an adversity economy to a well-being economy.
That adversity economy the speaker, Dr. Simova Saha, is referring to is capitalism, by the way, that she agreed with someone named Michelle in the chat during their webinar that they have to disrupt, dismantle, and redo to create a, quote, new system. And again, notice how she said we had to change what we measure and who gets to define what we measure. The Thriving Together springboard that the federal plan was based upon has some ideas on other indices America can use to measure our economy besides gross domestic product. Things like well-being and justice goals, education indices, climate indices, or measurement frameworks that already exist like the Opportunity Index or Just Capital rankings. Just Capital ranks businesses according to issues that they say they polled the public on that are important to them and that they track. This is essentially just another glorified ESG or environmental and social governance score that will force businesses to collect and report data on these various issues so that Just Capital can profile and rank them. Banks, investors, and customers can then use Just Capital's rankings to discriminate against companies that don't put their progressive policies into practice by withholding capital from them and eventually squeezing them out of the industry. Just Capital says in their mission statement that they strive to reflect on the role of systemic racism in American capitalism so that they are better equipped to fight against it. They believe that businesses and markets can and must be a greater force for good, and that by shifting the resources of the $19 trillion private sector, that they can address systemic issues at scale, including income inequality and lack of opportunity. Speaking of opportunity, let's talk about the Opportunity Index that was also mentioned in the springboard. This was developed by Opportunity Nation, a project of the Forum for Youth Investment and Child Trends. The index provides, quote, a snapshot of conditions that can be used to identify and improve access to opportunity for residents and their communities. Sounds lovely on the surface, right? I mean, who doesn't want people to have access to opportunity? But let's dive a little deeper. They rank states and counties according to what they say are the factors that create those conditions for community well-being: economy, education, health, and the community. This means, of course, more data collection in these areas in order to do that, so this can be tracked and scored. In Opportunity Nation's review of tools measuring opportunity in the United States document, they say that, quote, opportunity is not equally distributed in the United States. Both covert and overt racism drive disparities for people of color. Given the current national conversation around racial equity, tools that disaggregate data by race and ethnicity are called out explicitly in this review so that researchers and practitioners better know where to turn for that data. We hope this review helps identify data sources that can be useful as we advance a national conversation around racial equity and improving opportunity in communities of color. Now, I'm all about improving opportunity for everybody and removing actual racism that stands in the way of achieving that. But as we've seen in the federal plan and the Thriving Together Springboard, any data that's collected and disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and other demographics is done to point out disparities in outcomes and say that it's a product of systemic racism. That is then being used to argue for preferential treatment in regards to access to resources for those particular groups of people they say are being affected by that racism in the name of health equity. The other goal of collecting this data is to push for Marxist progressive policies like the ones that Forum for Youth Investment themselves are involved with that I covered in my video about whole child design principles. In the name of creating conditions for what they coin thriving youth, it will require education to be commingled with every other sector, kind of like the federal plan, and then require all those sectors to incorporate culturally responsive teaching, which is just critical race theory by a nicer sounding name. It will also turn our schools into actual medical facilities that provide all sorts of health services that they say create the conditions for optimal learning by meeting the basic needs of those students through CDC's whole school, whole child, whole community, or WISC model. Community schools will offer all sorts of services that usually fall under the purview of parents, like mental health, sexual and reproductive health, vaccines, and more, with the eventual goal of eliminating parental consent for administering these interventions altogether. So initiatives like the whole child design principles are naturally baked into the 78 recommendations the federal plan makes and meets both the basic needs for health and safety and lifelong learning planks of the vital conditions. It's no coincidence that many of the same people and organizations creating the solutions to the disparities in outcomes are many of the same people and organizations measuring the data that points out those disparities and lack of equity in the first place. Are you seeing the grift yet? Here are some other partners using the WIN measures to collect data on the vital conditions for their various reasons. So if there's just one thing you get out of this presentation, I can't emphasize enough that the eventual end goal of everything I've just shared with you today is all about data and creating a surveillance state with a digital social credit system like China's so that society and their behaviors can be controlled. Data collected locally through the WIN measurement framework and other various means shown here on how much states, counties, cities, businesses, and people contribute to the health or resilience of their communities will first be voluntarily ranked and rewarded, like we just talked about with just capital rankings and the Opportunity Index, but will eventually be involuntarily judged and punished.
A surveillance center, no resident goes unwatched. Hundreds of millions of cameras are installed all over China.
We have algorithms that automatically recognize certain behaviors. If someone isn't wearing a mask, for example, we immediately detect this wrongdoing.
No one can escape the camera's gaze, even when taking out the trash. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, data collection has ramped up even more in China. Health authorities use apps to try to identify infected individuals' potential contacts. Deng must scan a QR code with an app before entering the gallery district. His temperature is also taken.
The app looks at your health status and can track your journey. After the scan, it shows you if everything is okay.
If he had been in the same place as someone infected with the coronavirus, he would have been denied entry. Whenever COVID-19 is again detected in the country, the app becomes everyone's ticket to public life, to shop at a grocery store, to eat at a restaurant, even to get a taxi.
We installed a network of sensors in front of apartments. When the door's sensor registers people leaving the apartment in violation of the rules, we're alerted. District staff and the health department are then informed and can respond quickly.
Yu Chunwei is signing up for the social credit system. Yu has to link the data from his personal ID, then he'll get his score.
The better you score, the more advantages you have in your daily life. I think it encourages people to voluntarily follow the rules.
People are also penalized for making false statements in the country's COVID-19 app. People are rewarded for volunteering, staying fit through exercise, or using low-emission transportation. Donating blood also earns points. Other cities also reward organ donors, or everyday things like returning books to the library on time. China wants obedient citizens. Authorities entice with rewards and threaten with punishment.
The technological and data infrastructure that exists in China to constantly monitor and measure all of this data all of the time is not in place yet in most American towns. That's why the federal plan is so important to this agenda to fundamentally change America. It will infuse an insane amount of federal money through recent omnibus spending bills into local places to create that data gathering and monitoring infrastructure in the name of measuring resilience and making sure it's equitable. The money will be used to make cities SMART, which stands for Surveillance, Monitoring, Analysis, Reporting Technology Integrated. They'll sell these technologies to cities by saying it will make them more healthy and efficient and provide better services for their citizens. But really, it's a smokescreen for putting into place sensors that can keep track of everybody and everything.
Welcome to the city of the future, a smart city that knows everything about you, from how you like your coffee to whether you've broken the law, or even if you've grown a beard. While the smart city we're about to tour doesn't exist yet, all of the parts do. They're all components of real projects happening all over the world. Put them together, and this is what life may well be like in the not-too-distant future. You go to work. Your office building knows exactly who's coming and going and what they need, thanks to thousands of inbuilt sensors collecting data. Wherever you sit, the lighting will adjust to suit your preferences. The building will even recall your regular coffee order. On your way home, you pass lampposts laden with sensors and HD cameras that monitor and record the world around them 24/7. Air quality and traffic flow data tell you the quickest and cleanest route and alert emergency services to accidents. You also regularly update your doctors using data sent directly from your smartwatch. They analyze it and prescribe personalized drugs and supplements that are quickly 3D printed just for you. You go to bed, but the sensors in the street never sleep. They're busy policing antisocial behavior, identifying people smoking in unauthorized zones, or throwing rubbish from high-rise buildings. While much of this might sound pretty idyllic, it is not without issues. Smart cities go hand in hand with gathering and storing huge amounts of personal data and using it to control city life. For governments keen to control certain populations, this is an incredibly powerful tool. Every moment of your daily routine can be tracked. Anyone with access to this data can find out where you live, where you go every day, the places you visit at night, and who you're with. This data can be used by people with far more nefarious aims than making you the perfect soya latte. You could leave your phone at home, but with advanced facial recognition CCTV in the mix, authorities can easily keep tabs on you. In places like Xinjiang in China, where growing a beard can already get you reported, this is a frightening prospect. So, are the benefits of a smart city worth giving up privacy and freedom for? Can governments and corporations be trusted with such huge data sets on all of us? What happens if there's a mistake in the system? Or you want to overthrow the system itself?
Digital identity is also a means to this end of social control. As digital medical records and more are stored on blockchain and are attached to digital identities and carried in digital wallets that will be used for access to services in these smart cities, an individual's compliance, or lack thereof, with any government recommendations could, just like what happens in communist China, dictate their ability to travel freely, shop at stores, or even ride public transportation. In 2022, bank depositors that were planning a protest because the government had frozen their funds were stopped from doing so by the Chinese government by turning their health codes red. The article says, without a green code on their smartphone app, citizens lose access to public transport and spaces such as restaurants and malls, as well as the right to travel across the country. They are putting digital handcuffs on us, said a depositor from Sichuan province surnamed Chen, who declined to use his full name for fear of government retribution. The reality is that digital handcuffs are coming for every country and every person, disguised as nice-sounding words like sustainable, resilience, vital conditions, flourishing, thriving, prosperity, opportunity, health promotion, and well-being. All governments will be expected to make this transition to a well-being economy that will be tracked by subjective indices and controlled by a one-world health government, which all Americans and really all citizens of the world will eventually become subject to.
Why is it so important for us to make healthy choices?
Because by choosing the healthy option, our lives are more rewarding.
Our society is stronger.
Our economy is more prosperous.
And our development more sustainable.
But first, people need to be aware of what the healthy options are, so they can make the healthy choice.
Because an informed society knows what is needed to make communities healthier.
Governments, joined by civil society, can provide people with the advice of a healthy option.
Making more of the power over by 21st century information and communication technology.
People also require help to access the healthy options.
This means governments across all sectors must offer ways for people to be healthy.
From making healthy food available to eat, to ensuring the cities and towns in which we live are clean, safe, and healthy. Sometimes this means passing laws to protect people from harmful practices.
It can also mean investing in infrastructure that makes it easier for people to lead mobile and healthy lives.
This requires action, from those who make our laws
to those who make our lunches.
To use this awareness and access and make the healthy choice the only choice to take.
At home, school, and work.
The Shanghai Declaration on Health Promotion is a commitment made by leaders of the world to make this world a healthier place, a place where societies and economies develop sustainably.
This push to do away with capitalism and shift our economy to be one governed by the principles of global totalitarianism is being orchestrated and funded by our own federal government through the federal plan. We need Congress to do a full investigation into the federal plan, the 45-plus agencies driving it, Assistant Secretary of Health Admiral Richard or Rachel Levine, and the Department of Health and Human Services, who are currently housing and supporting this initiative. Please lend your help in reaching your elected representatives in Congress and getting them this information. You can send a link to this video or the tweet thread posted to the top of my Twitter profile at @IamLisaLogan with the short message that I've included in the description of this video. Let's work together to stop this here in America. Our freedom depends on it. Thank you.